All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Jamie Neikrie, who is the legislative director of the nonprofit organization Issue One, which seeks to limit the influence of money in politics. Additionally, Jamie's work focuses on strengthening American elections, protecting the American information ecosystem from manipulation and foreign interference, and defending the checks and balances that uphold our constitutional democracy. So, Jamie, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So, just to start off, how did you first get interested in the democracy space?
Oh boy, I'm what you might call a democracy nepo baby. Actually,
Okay.
yeah, I was indoctrinated at a young age. My mom works in democracy in higher ed. Her sort of mission for the last 30 years has been to try to get the higher ed sector to see itself as a greater piece of the democracy puzzle,
Okay.
which she had a lot of trouble with until the last 8 to 10 months, when suddenly a lot of higher ed institutions are waking up and saying, "Oh my God, are we part of the democracy infrastructure?" So there's a lot of she's really trying hard not to say "I told you so," but yeah, I come by it honestly. I was raised to believe that nothing is going to get done until you have an educated citizenry and
Yeah,
systems that work for the people that they're designed to work for, um, and in particular a federal government that is equipped with the tools it needs to serve those people.
definitely. Yeah, no, educated citizenry is definitely, I think, a core aspect of a functioning democracy, and I think we see the see that play out today, where there's so much misinformation out there that without the ability to navigate that, you end up in a troubling place, which I think we've found ourselves in. So,
Yeah.
um, was there a particular moment that made you feel like you needed to go into this space, kind of, and following your mom's footsteps to a certain extent, or was it just kind of like you always felt, okay, this is kind of a natural path for me, or
It wasn't an obvious
okay,
path. I actually originally worked in health policy. I worked for a hospital association. I worked for the Senate Help Committee. I worked for a consulting firm here in DC. So I always knew I wanted to be in DC, and I knew that I wanted to help effectuate change, but I didn't initially try democracy. I think probably I was a little resistant of it because of my mom's connection.
yeah,
But um, I think I saw all throughout, especially college, I did a lot of registering people to vote. I worked on what you might call a dialogue series, bringing folks together across divisive issues. Um, but I just saw how discouraged people were by our political process, and by the leaders that were, representing them or not representing them. And there was just a lot of apathy, even at a traditionally politically engaged college. There was a lot of people who just felt like there's no place for me in this system, or the
yeah,
system will never work for me. And I found that to be both upsetting and deeply concerning. And I think that kind of fueled a lot of my desire to work on democracy rather than any of the other many issues I care about, like gun control or,
sure,
the environment. There's a lot of things that I want to see changed and fixed. But until you have, a functioning democracy, it's going to be really hard to make any progress in those areas.
yeah, that's true. That's kind of the core aspect to being able to solve all the other issues. Is you got to start with that. So, I mean, issue one obviously does a lot of different work, but you all recently released a series called Profiles in Constitutional Courage and Cowardice.
Mhm.
How did this series come about?
Yeah. So this series is a couple months in the making. I think there's a long process to get here. So it starts, for me at least, with some of the work that I was doing around tech reform. I helped start our tech reform portfolio at Issue One after January 6th, and when we could see so very clearly how the hatred and disinformation and violence that was metastasizing online was showing up in the real world.
Yeah.
And we launched this initiative and team at Issue One And we worked with a lot of groups across the country who were helping track what was happening online, helping shed light on how the tech companies were working and the design of social media platforms. But in particular, they were working to prevent foreign influence operations. It was very clear that Russia meddled in our election, including trying to manipulate Americans. We saw the same thing and have over the last 5 years seen increased efforts from China and Iran. And none of that work was partisan for a long time. And then it really, this narrative started, the censorship industrial complex narrative, this idea that all of these groups were engaged in censorship. And one by one, from Harvard to the Stanford Internet Observatory to the Global Disinformation Index to, I can name 15, 20 groups off the
Yeah.
top of my head that got targeted as part of this narrative. And I and others were trying to pull folks together to say, we got to join forces and push back against this specious narrative. But what happened was people kept kind of ducking their heads and saying, oh, thank God it's not me this time. And in some cases, I won't name names, maybe even relished the idea that their competitors were
Okay.
getting
Yeah.
knocked down a peg or two.
Yeah.
But then the narrative turned on them, and one by one, they all got picked off. And that sector, which did really critical work, has now been decimated. And that was my first inclination that this was going to be a pattern that was going to be repeated. And then lo and behold, we saw the Trump administration do the same thing with law firms. We saw them do the same thing with higher ed institutions, this kind of one by one singling out and targeting. And again, rather than this being a unifying moment for people, they often caved to the administration and no one came to their defense. And you even saw this with I'm trying to remember the name of the first law firm that struck a deal with the Trump administration. It wasn't Wilmer Hale. It doesn't matter, whatever. If you look back at that first statement that they put out, they even said in there, um, you know, we hoped people would help us, but instead they tried to poach our clients, But that's the law sector in particular. There's a
Right.
not a lot of unifying work within that sector.
Yeah.
Um, but what we feel is necessary right now, what issue one feels is necessary, is a unified civil society. When you look at what has resisted authoritarianism in other countries, it's often not the legislature, which pains me to say as a legislative director. It's often not the judicial branch, which often hands power to the authoritarian. It's civil society. This has been true in Sudan. It was true in Poland. It was true in Brazil. Again and again, civil society, broad swaths across political boundaries, coming together to say this is not normal, this is not okay, has been the strongest force to defend the rule of law and push back on authoritarianism. And that's what we need to see in this country. And there have been inklings, there have been moments, and I'm happy to talk about some of those things that we've seen.
Yeah.
But and those are what I would call instances of courage, people standing up and saying, I'm not going to cave to this authoritarian impulse or this instance of executive overreach, even if there was political risk to them. But there's also been just as many, if not more, much more examples of cowardice. And we feel like we need a little hope right now. And we also need to be shedding light on people who are doing the opposite. And so that's where this series comes in. And we're excited about its potential to help highlight those narratives, potentially help shift some of the work that's happening out there to be a tool for the broader democracy sector. So that's what kind of motivated us to want to launch this.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously really important work because I think a lot of people are probably a little surprised by how much the Trump administration has been able to kind of bully different people and organizations into doing whatever it wants, just because they don't want to get, into a fight with the Trump administration, the federal government. How did we get to this point historically? Because when people think about America, and there are people that are probably many Americans aren't even aware of that the Trump administration has been able to course these different organizations into coming to some agreement with them, or paying a bunch of money to the Trump administration because they don't want to get in a long lawsuit. The United States has always been thought of for many people as being kind of home of the brave. But what
Mhm.
we're seeing, obviously, is this battle between, as you've all pointed out, issue one, cowardice and courage. How did this happen? Is it institutional? Is it, where did it come about?
I think there's two longer term evolutions that have gotten us to this point. So, one is the consolidation of executive power, which long predated President Trump. There are instances going back all the way to President Nixon in particular of presidents wielding their powers in ways that they never should have. Now, in the case of the Nixon administration, their wielding of power was then met by Congress with a moment of real reform. That was one of the greatest moments for democracy restoration in our country's history. But since then, we've seen countless examples of presidents seizing power that they shouldn't have, whether it's the Obama administration putting a tariff on tires in 2009 without Congress's approval, or airstrikes in Libya without Congress's approval. That's a violation of Congress's war powers. The Biden administration, I would say, way over relied on executive emergencies during the pandemic in a way that was that circumvented Congress's authority. He also, President Biden, put tariffs on Chinese metals, again, without Congress's approval. So this is not a new phenomenon. Emergency powers, tariff powers, war powers, all of these things have started to slowly be enveloped into the executive branch when the Constitution and our founders intended those powers to be held by Congress. Now, Congress also has a role to play in that. They have abdicated those responsibilities over a long period of time. So that kind of predates President Trump, and then he comes into office, especially in the second term, and has used those powers in ways that we have never seen before. So the trend long predates him, but if there was already a crack in the window, he burst it open. And, we've seen that in obviously the widespread unilateral global tariffs, which he enacted using emergency powers, weaponizing the Justice Department to go after some of his political adversaries, monetizing the White House for personal gain, whether it's the East Wing ballroom or the Bitcoin stuff. Some of the pocket rescissions. Rescissions is another place where past presidents have abused Congress's power of the purse. But the Trump administration has used them and coerced Congress to use them in ways that we've never seen before, which takes away from arguably Congress's most important function, which is setting our budget and deciding where our nation's money goes. And then the dismantling of independent watchdogs and attacks on independent agencies, and reducing the independence of key agencies, whether it's the Fed, the Federal Reserve, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center. You could go on and on and on. So that's the first trend, is this like rapid and really dangerous consolidation of power in the executive branch. The second trend that I want to call out, and it's a little tricky, but I think it's really important, and it's something that issue one tries to articulate, is the difference between authoritarianism and conservatism. I think we have made a huge mistake and I'm just speaking for the kind of democracy sector here.
Sure.
I think the democracy sector has made a huge mistake conflating those two things. Historically, authoritarianism doesn't have to emerge within the Conservative Party or within the Republican Party. We've seen
Right.
authoritarian impulses from the left in this country, namely in FDR. There have been far left fringes, in the past, especially around the Vietnam War, that engaged in really extreme levels of violence that entered authoritarian territory. And across the world, whether it's Maoist China, Stalinist Russia, um, we have seen, or USSR, we've seen lots of examples of left wing authoritarianism. In this country, tends to emerge more from the right, but again, it's non exclusive. And Issue One is a fiercely bipartisan organization. We meet and work with Republicans all the time. More than half of the meetings I take on Capitol Hill are with Republicans. We love working with Republicans who want to stand up for the rule of law, and those do exist. They are some of the people that we will be highlighting in our constitutional courage and cowardice profiles. We need to then distinguish between conservatism and or republicanism and authoritarianism. They are not the same thing. We can disagree over policies all we want, but when you resort to violence, when you assume power that is not yours, when you demonize your political adversaries, when you break down our separation of powers, those are all examples of authoritarianism. And we need to call those out and make clear that they are distinct from conservatism.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you would think it would be, for I guess the general public, which isn't necessarily all that political or part of the right or left, but are you know a lot. I mean, many people are just kind of independent and not sure what to make of politics today. Conflating conservatism with authoritarianism does seem pretty odd that would happen. So to a certain extent, does this kind of highlight how the nonprofit sector and the democracy space can kind of be in a bubble to a certain extent, like an echo chamber where you get enough people kind of pushing one viewpoint where you start to, because you have the absence of probably conservative voices in the democracy space to a certain extent in comparison to people on the left, you start to then have this emergence where you might conflate those two of conservatism and authoritarianism. Is that kind of the problem you're getting at in the democracy space in terms of how this could have come about, where people have started to conflate the two things? Or
It's an interesting question. I think there's a little bit of truth to that. I
okay,
think um, there are probably times when the democracy sector or the left, which is distinct from the democracy sector, jumped to label something as authoritarianism when actually it was just a policy they didn't
okay,
like. And that is something that sort of denigrates our credibility.
yeah,
Um, but there are just as many times when people didn't criticize clearly authoritarian actions
mm,
because they didn't want to be seen as partisan. And I think that that is a much bigger problem.
okay,
Um, there was a lot of, oh, well, we can't call this out because a Republican is saying it. When the problem wasn't republicanism or conservatism, the problem was that the action was authoritarian. And
okay,
those are, again, two different things. Um, I will the main pushback I want to give on what you just said is there are plenty of conservatives that are within, I would say, the broader democracy movement. There are
hmm,
lots of libertarian groups that fight for limited government. There are lots of freedom of speech and freedom of expression groups that fight to protect people's right to say whatever they want, especially in the face of government interference. Um, there are groups that defend and work, in the democracy sector for what I think you would think of as traditionally conservative groups like veterans or farmers or small businesses. Um, the problem is that the groups that have met the moment and realized, oh, this is really dangerous and we have to call this out for what it is. I would put Cato into that category. I would put FIRE,
yeah,
as a freedom of expression group, into that category. These are groups that have stuck to their principles and called out bad behavior on the right and the left. They've been saying the same thing uh, during the Trump administration, during the Biden administration, during the first Trump administration, during the Obama administration. They have remained consistent. Those groups and many others, countless Republican members of Congress that we work with very closely, have been basically pushed out of the Republican Party. they're no longer seen as Republican
Sure.
because they took a a never Trump stance. Um, I think that's a really dangerous proposition when your sort of party fealty and your fealty to one person in particular is held up over your commitment to your ideology or to the principles that you believe represent the Republican Party. So that's the challenge is external and it's within the democracy sector, but it's also within the Republican Party.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, why do you think then that issue came about where people started to kind of mix authoritarianism and conservatism as being part of the same issue in the democracy space? If that's why I understand, like your main point was to highlight we need to stop doing that. So how did that come about in the first place then?
Yeah, I mean, I think this. Um, I think the rise of Trumpism and
Okay.
Trump himself has made this really challenging. Trump is an authoritarian figure in the way that we have not seen in this country since Nixon, since McCarthy, since FDR. Um, he wields power in ways that are completely out of line with what our founders intended. Um, he also wields power in ways that are completely out of line with traditional Republican values.
Yes, true.
um, and the Republican Party should have called that out.
Yeah.
Republican leaders who did call that out deserve to be lifted up more than they probably were. Um, but once Trump became the nominee, once he became president, once there became this sort of broad MAGA contingent within the Republican Party, there was a real shying away of criticizing a lot of the behavior.
Okay.
Uh, and that was true from the democracy sector. It was true from the media. There's a lot of folks probably with a little egg on their shirt here. Egg on their face. Is that the right? I don't know if the right
I think
face.
probably egg on your face, but it could be
Egg
on
on
the
your
shirt as
face.
well.
Egg on your shirt works too. Either way, you don't want
Egg
it.
anywhere, yeah.
Um, and it's tricky. I get it. Like I work for a bipartisan organization. We have to protect our ability to have credible meetings with Republicans and do that. And but to me, the way to do that is not to never criticize these things, but to
Yeah.
say this action is not in line with traditional conservative values and it is authoritarianism. That's completely different than criticizing conservative policies, conservative ideology, conservative um, traditional conservative policy stances. Um, Criticizing that and only that would be engaging in partisan activity and would be
Hmm.
improper, I think, for a
Sure.
bipartisan democracy organization. Criticizing authoritarianism, I would say, is our job and
You would
has to
think, yeah. Yeah, definitely usually a good thing to call that out regardless of, what organization you're a part of. Yeah.
be. Right.
Um,
And I would
eh
hope, again, that people would call it out when they see it on the left, too.
right. Yes, that would yes, one would hope. Yeah, because I think that that's one of the things that it's cool about what issue 1 has done is, constantly trying to work across the aisle because there are obviously the nonprofit space is pretty big as well as the democracy space, and there are a lot of organizations that also kinda stick to one side of the spectrum that don't
Mm.
necessarily, work on democracy issues from across the aisle. And so I think you do highlight like a really important aspect of needing to ensure that everyone's on the same page of okay, you can be a conservative and have nothing to do with the Trump MAGA movement, and at the same time you could also call out balls and strikes in a fair way, regardless of whose side is perpetuating authoritarian behavior. So um,
Yeah.
but are you concerned at all, as an organization in this space, and having seen, a government in the U.S. really start to put pressure on a lot of different people and organizations? Are you concerned at all about the risks of government retaliation for the work done at places like Issue One?
Yes. Very concerned.
Yeah.
I would say we're probably not the top of any list. The groups that are suing him and suing the administration are probably higher on our list, as are reproductive rights groups, climate justice groups, racial equity groups, unions, some of the left perceived to be left wing philanthropies that he has called out a few times. Um, but those are we work with some of those folks. We have, you know, again, partners across the aisle that are concerned about potential retaliation. I don't think this is just the left wing groups. I think a lot of folks are concerned about their 501c3 status being targeted by the
Yeah.
IRS in particular. Um, that includes, religious groups. So, yeah, I mean, there's been a huge push everywhere in this sector to shore up your physical security, shore up your cyber security, have plans in place for what happens if, the IRS comes barging down our door, what happens if the Justice Department comes barging down our door, what happens if some of our staff start getting targeted online or doxxed. We've already had a few instances of that happening.
Nice.
Like one of them happened to me in particular.
Jeez.
Uh,
Okay.
I mean, it was light, but like it was,
Yeah.
there was a shot across the bow,
Yeah.
and in a way that scares you.
Sure.
Um,
Of course.
we've seen a lot of folks, higher ed in particular has had a lot of, you know, these are the 100 most dangerous academics in the country, and there's a picture of their face with a target on it, and then it tells you where to find them, what their number is, what their email address is, where their office is on campus. There's a lot of examples like that, and that kind of stuff is really scary. And it's unfortunate that I know a lot of people who have had to kind of go underground and not do public speaking and get rid of their LinkedIn profiles, and a lot of orgs have taken their staff off their websites. There's a lot of scrubbing that's happening right now to try to protect people, and that shouldn't be necessary. We should feel empowered to be doing the work we're doing,
Yeah.
and we should feel safe to do it in this country. And a lot of people don't right now.
Yeah, I mean that is a pretty horrifying element of this, and especially because I mean, obviously there has been political violence throughout American history, but it's so easy to find people today because of the internet,
Yeah.
where it just seems like if someone really wants to learn about you, they can. So that's just so concerning because you're just so much more exposed today with the technology that we have. So, based on your career so far and all the experiences you've had and witnessing kind of the evolution of American politics in your career, you know, are you hopeful about the future and being able to help, the United States kind of find the courage to get through this moment in time, to protect democracy?
Oh boy. I wish I could say I was hopeful. The honest truth is I'm very scared.
Okay.
I'm scared for the direction of our country and the future of our democracy. And um, I don't see a lot of easy fixes or short term fixes to the problems that we're facing. I think this is going to be a 20, 30, 40-year fight for the health of our democracy. That being said, because I don't want to be just a Debbie Downer, um, I do think again we're starting to see real instances of courage, of collective courage, of non cooperation. Just this past month, we've had the Pentagon reporters join together again across political lines to reject the deal from the Pentagon that would have dramatically restricted their freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And they all walked out in unison, which was an incredibly powerful display of solidarity. We saw colleges and universities join together to reject the Trump administration's compact, which would have dramatically reduced their academic freedom. Um, in that instance in particular, I find that extremely encouraging because Brown University was one of the groups that rejected the compact. Brown had kind of famously accepted a deal with the Trump administration back in the summer. So I kept thinking to myself, okay, well, what was different here? Well, the difference is Brown was isolated. at the time. Again, to go back to the one by one strategy, they were targeted, and people didn't come to their defense, or they didn't feel like they had, a contingent at their backs, and they took the deal, even though, I think everybody in the higher ed sector would tell you that it's incredibly damaging, and they're not the only ones who took those deals for academic freedom. And what happened since then is, first of all, the Trump administration offered the same deal to 9 different schools at the same time. That was a huge mistake on their part. And I expect them to learn from that. Hopefully, we can too, by turning individual decisions into collective decisions. Um, but you also had mobilization from Brown students, Brown faculty, Brown donors who said, hey, we were really upset by what you did back in June. Now you have a chance to do better. And they did. And they stood, firm with all these other colleges and universities and said no. So I think there's more and more examples of that kind of resistance, of, again, non-cooperation, which is such an important principle right now, every day. And those little acts of courage give me hope.
I'm glad there are some hope out there then. But I mean, it's interesting that your point about, it being a 20, 30, 40-year fight. That is a very disturbing thought, but also I think one that's fair to say, because this has been post Trump era. Obviously, he's probably not going to live 20, 30, 40 more years. That's a long time for any human being. I'd break records.
And hopefully he won't seek a third term.
Right.
Or
Yeah. I mean, if that would, yes. I mean, that's the immediate aspect that people fear in terms of democracy. But 20, 30, 40 years later, I mean, this is looking at someone who, would perhaps be more politically savvy and more knowledgeable about how you take down a democracy, coming
right.
to power and then trying to dismantle it. And I think it kind of reminds me of when people talked about, like, when COVID came out, and a lot of people analyzing pandemics, epidemiologists would say, like, this isn't really the pandemic we're worried about. This is bad, but it's not
Mm,
the one that we're worried about. And so it makes me think about then, Trump is kind of a test run for authoritarian movement in the United States, because obviously he is, quite old, in comparison to someone who could come in the future that would be more knowledgeable about the political system itself. So that's a really interesting question that you raised, that I think people need to be thinking about. Like, just because Trump is gone does not mean that authoritarianism goes away.
yeah, I mean, I think people made this mistake in 2020. When President Biden won, there was a lot of reacting about, like, we did it. We defeated authoritarianism, and democracy is going to be restored. But because that sentiment only came from the left, it didn't get restored. Congress failed to pass any of the meaningful things that it needed to pass. Protection of voting rights, efforts to restrict the influence of corporations in politics, reining in ethics and emoluments clauses to make sure presidents can't um, turn the White House into a money making operation for them. All of the Article One powers that I've been talking about, and needing to restore those to Congress. There is a wide range of clear policies that need to change in order to safeguard democracy. Again, the gaps that were created existed before Trump, but when he burst open the window, I guess the one silver lining here is he showed us all the things that were broken in the first place. And we can see very, very clearly now all the things that need to change. And there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of bills introduced to those effects, some of them bipartisan, some of them Democrat only, some of them Republican only. But none of them really passed. And so Congress didn't really do its job. I think civil society kind of let down its guard and wasn't prepared for what was going to come. And then at a community level, we're more divided than we were before. We were more divided than when we were in the first Trump administration. So none of the underlying trends that got us to this point got better because President Biden won.
Yeah.
Um, And so we can't just count on elections to change things. We can't just count on the idea that, okay, this is Trump's last term. He's going to go quietly into the night. And then, regardless of who wins, Republican or Democrat, they won't have the same authoritarian impulses, and we'll do better. I just don't think we can take any of that for granted. I think once things are broken, it's very hard to mend them. And there's a lot of folks, again, on the right and left, who would want to take advantage of some of the powers that President Biden or President Trump has used. And so, what is required is both parties coming together and saying, this has really gotten out of hand, whether this is executive overreach, political violence, um, division and polarization within our country, the gerrymandering that's happening all across the country right now. I think everybody on both sides of the aisle would tell you privately that that's gone way too far.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
you know, some of these things need to be fixed, but they can only be fixed if both sides come together to fix them. If it's just if the idea here is that a Dem is going to win the presidency and the Democrats are going to fix everything, that's just not going to do it. It's not going to cut it.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's also pretty disturbing to me is that, when we talk about these issues and the way we're talking about them is is really reflective of only a portion of the population in terms of people actually thinking about these problems. I think I think many people don't even recognize authoritarianism, kind of rising the U.S. and they're just thinking about their wallet. They're thinking about the economy, um, and I think there's many Americans that are so politically disengaged that this isn't even really on their radar. They just think, oh, he's kind of a funny character as a president, and yeah, he's not like normal or whatever. But they're not following the day to day aspect. Um, Given that demographic is pretty influential in terms
Mm.
of how people vote, how do you resolve that problem? Because we're not only dealing with social media, which obviously has, I think, done drastic damage to people understanding the complexities of governance and what's happening in the country, but now the artificial intelligence is on the rise.
Hmm.
With ChatGPT can have lots of replicas that obviously promote its own political agendas, and now we have AI videos popping up. I mean, it seems like Pandora's box is kind of opening, and we still haven't figured out how to solve this basic issue with education and making sure people are on the same page.
Hmm. Well, um, I'll push back slightly, and then I will answer your question.
Okay, fair enough.
So this is another place where I think I have a little bit of hope. So issue one just did nationwide polling, testing how Americans feel about checks and balances, about our constitutional norms and values. And what we saw was across the board, across the aisle, people are still strongly supportive of checks and balances, of co-equal branches of government, of specific things like congressional authority over tariffs and power of the purse and stuff like that. Even when you tell them, hey, those things are going to slow down a president that you might agree with, um, they still express support for them. The most striking result from our poll was we asked, what are your biggest concerns right now? And the top three were what you would expect. It was inflation, immigration, and jobs. But the fourth issue was presidential overreach. The fourth issue was presidential overreach, just
Yeah,
behind kitchen table issues. So people are seeing this, and again, that was not just the left; that was across the aisle. I think people are, they might not be calling it authoritarianism. They might not be, attaching it to some of the wonky literature, whatever that we're reading here in DC or in the democracy sector. But when you see masked agents come and raid the car wash in your town
yeah,
and take people away, um, who are being totally civil and lawful otherwise, I think people know that there's something not right about that. When your law firm or your school starts getting attacked for the classes it's teaching, I think people know there's something not right about that. When Jimmy Kimmel is pulled off the air because of something he jokes about, people know there's something not right about that. The tariffs, I think in particular, has woken a lot of people up. I've heard stories from truckers who have to bring goods across the Canadian border, and they go across on a Tuesday and it costs X amount, and then they go across on a Wednesday and there's a completely new amount, and there's a new code for a new tariff that wasn't there yesterday, and then by Friday it's different, and there's this whiplash that's happening in our economy with tariffs and with other things that stems from one man having too much power. And people know that. I think people can see that instability and they can feel that instability. Businesses don't know what to expect a day, a month, a year from now. So again, they might not call it authoritarianism, but I think they can feel the system breaking a little bit. And I think that scares them. In terms of what we do about it, I think you're absolutely right that civic education and reining in some of the reining in or helping people understand what they're seeing online and how to parse through disinformation and AI sludge and all that kind of stuff
Yeah.
is really important. So too is community level organizing, and I think this is where a lot of stuff is going. I think a lot of the action is moving to the states and localities, but we've seen some of these rallies and town halls and um, you know local level actions be really powerful because people are confused and people are upset and people are frustrated and they want to have a venue to come together and talk about it. And that's not a Republican versus Democrat thing. You see people of all political stripes at these kind of functions. And we need to find ways to encourage more of that, to facilitate it thoughtfully, to help people make sense of what's happening. And as I think we have a reshifting of political boundaries in this country, that presents an opportunity for people to not be so allied to R versus D and more allied to their values and the values they want this country to have, and find ways to work together across lines to advance those values. So I think there's a lot of deep work that's going to need to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think, yeah, you made a lot of really interesting points because I do think that, one of the kind of silver linings of the chaos that people are witnessing, unfortunately, today across the political spectrum, everyone's seeing, these policies go into effect and impact people in so many negative ways, is that it does also raise awareness in people that, politics isn't this just kind of, you know, imaginary thing that's out there. It's real life and it'll come to your community eventually. You can't escape it. And hopefully that does raise awareness. And if your polling is showing that, is great, because I think, one of the things that people might sometimes be skeptical about polling is that, okay, well, if someone says on a survey, that's one thing, but whether they actually believe it in real life when confronted with the complexity of an issue is
Mm-hmm.
another. And so it's good to know that at least appears that it's trending in the right direction, and that these negative things are having an impact on people's mentalities about what this administration is doing, because that will be key to preventing a worse administration in the future coming to power and then doing even worse things. But I guess we just kind of have to hope for the best in that regard.
Well, I think that's right. And we can't just rely on negative emotions. It can't just be fear and
Yeah.
confusion and people being motivated by what they don't like. People need to be motivated for something. They need something to believe in. They need candidates they can believe in. Here's an example of illiberalism on the left. This week, Congressman Chuy Garcia um, announced that he wasn't running again, and then announced his retirement at the 11:59 mark, so that only his chief of staff could file to run for his seat. Everybody else missed the mark, and this is a heavily Democrat district, and so only the Democrat whoever wins the Democratic primary is going to win the general election,
Right.
which right in itself is a problem. Um, and that's an example where the voters now are being deprived the ability to have a real conversation about who they want to succeed Congressman Garcia, what the best fit for their district is, who they can believe in. They're just being basically manipulated into no decision or no choice, and then a decision is being made for them. That is not how our system is supposed to operate. That is not how our democracy is supposed to function. Um, so, every time something like that happens, it really corrodes people's faith in the system.
Yeah.
And, um, we need candidates we can believe in. We need institutions that function the way they're supposed to and that we can believe in. It's not just enough to be against what's happening right now.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I think at some point there has to be some type of societal unity and agreement on just what it means to be an American and create a political system for all Americans versus the tribalistic politics that we have, where it's okay, this party versus this party, and let's just battle it out and see who wins. That's
Mm-hmm.
obviously really not good for long-term solutions. um,
Yeah.
but thinking then in the big picture and giving you a chance to kind of reflect a little bit on yourself in this historical moment and the position you're in. What do you want, future historians that may listen to this interview at some point in time as part of some type of archive, to know about the work you do in this moment?
Hmm. I I hope that when historians look back on this period that we're in, they are looking back from a place of much greater stability and democratic health than we're in right now. And I hope that they will remember when they do that that was not guaranteed. That those moments where everything feels like it's working the way it's supposed to, and people are following our democratic norms and obeying the rule of law, and some of these 80-20 issues that we haven't seen ever get passed in Congress in our day are passing in their day. I hope that when they look back on this period of time, they'll remember that none of those things are guaranteed, and that it is the product of all of us lifting up these democratic norms, following the rule of law, forcing our members of Congress to do the same, um, and putting the health of our country and our democracy before our own sort of partisan viewpoints. As long as we act like the United States is special and this democratic project that we've been on is just going to keep going forever, I think that it will always be vulnerable. It has to require thoughtful, intentional, restorative practices every single day.
Definitely. Yeah, it's true. You can't take something like this for granted because it isn't written in stone. And that's definitely an issue Americans have had for a long time, really thinking that, well, it's America. Of course it's going to be fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, what other stuff are you working on issue one? And what's the best way for people to keep track of that work?
Sure. So we're working on a big campaign that we call We the People, which is a grassroots, grass tops advocacy effort to restore the rule of law, and in particular, restore Congress's role in protecting the rule of law. We've rolled out a policy platform that articulates a series of places where Congress needs to reclaim its powers from, again, tariff authority, war powers, emergency powers, power of the purse. So we're doing that. We've got grassroots and town halls all across the country. I'll be moderating an event that we're doing next week in Salt Lake City with former Governor John Kasich and others. And we have lots of sort of grass tops communities where people can join in and get involved if they're, again, concerned about what they're reading in the news and want to get off the sidelines and start playing a role. So all that's on our website. You can find it on X, on LinkedIn. So, encourage everybody to find a place to plug in. And if it's not issue one, there's lots of other great democracy organizations that you can plug into. But I do hope it's issue one because I selfishly
Right.
believe in the work that we're doing right now. And
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. No bias there at all. That's right.
no bias.
Yeah.
I've been here for 4 years, and I'm proud of the work we're
Yeah.
doing right now.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast, and really honestly, thank you for the work you're doing because obviously that's incredibly important, especially in this moment. So.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ben, and thanks for encouraging this conversation.